So earlier this month in San Diego, the San Diego Union Tribune ran a great article about how a congressman spent campaign funds for rabbit air travel. Not his actual rabbit, right? But the reason they were able to run this is because of campaign finance disclosures, right? So the member of Congress receives contributions, has to report the source of the contributions as well as the expenditures. And so this was one of the expenditures, okay? And so part of my research agenda is, do people care about this kind of disclosure? Do we need audits to help make the disclosures more credible? Or is the disclosure itself enough? How do information intermediaries like the media, but also transparency groups that communicate the information, how can they be more effective? Things like this, right? Okay, so did this just start going? Okay, here we go. So in this paper, we look at whether campaign finance transparency can affect election results. Are legislators who violate campaign finance laws, are they harmed electorally? And how does the exposure of things like this bunny flying that might be considered abuses of campaign finance, right? How do they affect legislator behavior while they're already in office? So we theorize that transparency provides information to voters about candidate traits, not just the policies, not just the interest groups to whom they'll be responsive, but actually the kind of people that you're dealing with. Voters learn about legislator valence characteristics such as honesty and corruption. So valence are simply non-policy attributes that candidates have. We found a natural experiment in the late 1970s, a one-time random audit that the FEC conducted on House members' campaign accounts. We've been in touch with one of the auditors who was at the FEC at the time and just retired as one of the head auditors. And he describes it as a heady time at the FEC, where they thought they had real powers, right? And shortly, this thing is running on its own, Christian, just so you know. And shortly after these audits were run, the Congress yanked the authority for them to do that, took the budget to zero. Okay, so I'm sorry, this thing has got a mind of its own. So what do we find? That increased transparency measured as these audits results in reduced vote margins, particularly when violations are found, a higher likelihood of retiring or resigning, particularly when violations are found, and more travel back home, particularly if violations were found. All right. So the conventional wisdom, some policy advocates and legal scholars, and the Supreme Court and 40 years of jurisprudence, claim that transparency of campaign finance helps voters to identify policy positions and ideologies of candidates. Okay, a few disagree, though this is generally the kind of the informational benefit that we talk about, and especially in the jurisprudence. We move away from this debate, and we theorize that information about the non-policy characteristics of candidates can be learned through transparency, particularly when the disclosures are audited. Okay, so voters glean information from campaign finance disclosures, legislator traits, honest or dishonest, right? Compliant, non-compliant, clean or corrupt, are revealed through audits. Candidates who fail to comply might be less preferable on non-policy dimensions than those who do manage to comply. And the information that's revealed can be used by the candidates to inform voters, right? You can use it to say, look how clean I am, or look how dirty the other guy is. Campaign challengers are incentivized to point it out if their opponents violated. Okay, so to summarize, voters make decisions on election day based on perceptions of candidate traits and valence characteristics of incumbents, in addition to policy, right? And transparency institutions affect legislator re-elections. So bad or dirty candidates who have campaign finance violations will have more difficult re-elections. It doesn't mean they won't get re-elected, but they will have a more difficult time getting re-elected. And anticipating this, they will change their behavior when the audits happen, way before the audits go public. All right, so they'll opt out by retiring or resigning, or they'll run again, but increase their efforts back home. All right, so here's our empirical strategy. So we found this unique natural experiment where the FEC conducted a random audit of 10% of U.S. House members' campaign finances following the 76 election. To be clear, what they did is they randomized by seat. So all candidates that were running for a given seat were audited, and then there was this tiny little threshold below which, if they were only getting like 1% polling, that they wouldn't audit them, okay? And the results of the audits were revealed prior to the 78 election for 36 of the 41 that were audited, okay? All right, so here's the timeline. So here's our November 1976 election. No one knows the audits are gonna happen. The audits are announced after, okay? Remember, we're in the wake of Watergate here, right? That's how the FEC even came to be, all right? The audits start occurring, 4 months after the election, and they go for about a year, okay? And then the results are made public starting in December 77 into June 78, well in advance of the election. And there are 5 straggler cases that we're still kind of dealing with empirically. Christian is going to talk a little bit more about that. And they come to light after the November 78 election, okay? So just to be clear, this is the data that the Bedrosian money allowed us to gather. We are very, very grateful. All right, I'm going to hand off to Christian now.
Okay, thanks. So, one thing that Abby's already alluded to that's really exciting about this is that we have a natural experiment of elected officials to determine their behavior. Ideally, all 41 cases would have actually been announced at the same time, so we're interested in feedback on what we might be able to do about that. But in terms of what we're going to examine on the election component of it, do voters hold legislators accountable when they are in violation of campaign finance? The unit of analysis is the district in which the U.S. House member is running in, or the U.S. House member. We analyze all election results involving incumbents in the 1978 election post-audit. And so the dependent variable, or the outcome variable, the thing that we're trying to explain, is the incumbent two-party vote share in one model, just simply what percentage of the vote did the incumbent win by. Presumably those who are audited that have bad findings will do worse than those who do not. Do they retire or resign? A lot of congressional elections are not particularly competitive. Those that are, people will strategically choose to retire or leave knowing that they might lose. And then also we look at the anticipatory behavior. How frequently do they go back to their district, right? So constituency service, travel home can help you get reelected. If you're concerned that an audit revealed bad information about you to the voters, you better try to go help those voters, remind them that you're a good person. Treatment variables. So the treatment or the independent variables, given that this is a natural experiment, the audit is randomly assigned to the treatment group. 10% of legislators were audited. As far as we can tell, that was actually random. The control group did not receive audit. So that's, in one model, we just simply code that a 1 if they got the audit, a 0 if the legislators did not get the audit. And then because of those 5 straggler cases that were audited by the FEC prior to the 78 election, but were not released to the public until after the 78 election, we also have a model that's not completely random in terms of the measure, but where we measure a 1 if the audit occurred and was released prior to 78, and 0 if not. All right, and so were the audits random? If you study regular people, not people engaging in public policy like legislators, you can do experiments really easily. If you study people who make public policy, it's difficult to have experiments that you can conduct on them for a variety of reasons, especially if you wanted to go back in time and look at the FEC in the 70s, it would literally be impossible to do an experiment even if you could do it for otherwise. So what's nice about this is that it is random, or as best we can tell, it was an actual random assignment of legislators to audits, because that buys us a lot of leverage for our analytical ability to show that transparency has an impact on outcomes. And so just to sort of run through, was it actually random what the legislators did? Or excuse me, what the FEC did to the legislators. This came up in congressional testimony after the audits occurred. Claiborne Pell asked the auditor under oath, how do you randomly select the House seats? Do you have a roulette wheel? FEC staffer, who Abby has actually interviewed, who's now retired, responded, Senator, it is done by a computer-driven process. Random numbers are generated by programs fed to the computer, and it is directed to give us a random number that will select a certain number of congressional districts. For an expert on the subject of randomization, we can go to the nearest church of my faith and find how they pick bingo numbers. This is what Frank Thompson, congressman from New Jersey, said. Does anyone remember what's infamous about Frank Thompson? So he was later implicated in Abscam. Just a couple years later, he did not like the random audit program. He was not audited himself. He was in the control group, but this came up in testimony where they were pushing, is it really random? It appears that it was random. We also checked with the auditor. The auditor suggested that they set a seed consistent with what we were able to uncover in the congressional testimony. So we think that it's really one of the few instances of a random natural experiment on elected officials who make public policy. All right, so just what were these cases like, right? The unit of analysis is members of Congress. There's basically 3 different types of members. So the audit was random, but if they are dirty or clean, if they have significant campaign finance violations or not, that's not random, obviously. So example 1 is Larry Pressler. He was randomly assigned to be audited, revealed no campaign finance violations. He's a clean legislator. He also infamously, in the Abscan sting a couple years later, was the only person who got up and left the room and said, I don't do this, when the FBI tried to implicate him. So I think that's an interesting case because he was audited and there were no findings, and the FBI gave a sting to him. There were no findings. He may be the cleanest member of Congress in contemporary history. But 57% of people were like this. 57% of the people who were audited were like this. They basically had clean audits. There were no significant campaign finance violations. All right, example 2, Congressman Billy Lee Evans from the 8th District of Georgia near Macon, Georgia. He was a violator, right? So he was audited and there were significant campaign finance violations found. His audit revealed $30,000 in illegal contributions and $60,000 of disclosure violations. And so legal contributions, for the most part, included things like contributions from corporations, from unions, things that were barred by the Watergate FEC reforms, going over the limits that were also allowed, and then simply not disclosing contributions as well. The what?
Missing deadlines can be counted as a disclosure violation.
Oh yeah, and so missing deadlines, so not revealing prior to the election, for instance. And so that might not sound like a lot, but in today's dollars, that's $125,000 and $250,000 respectively for those 2 violations. It's a lot of money that wasn't being disclosed and or that was being illegally taken. And these are pretty typical values in the data for those who were audited and findings were found. And so 43% of House members had these violations of those who were audited. And the most common were disclosure, hiding records, or misstatements. And then illegal contributions or excessive contributions were common too. One thing I do want to mention in our conversation with the auditor, very minor violations, they didn't actually list as a true violation because they were already getting wind of unpopularity on the Hill about this program. And so, somebody who forgot to submit a receipt for $2, those were not considered violations. So it was more of a Billy Lee Evans style violation if you were found to be an audit. Yeah.
Are there any particular, the violators versus the clean, do they have different parts of the country or something like that?
No, so the really cool thing, they are from all over the country, but the really cool thing about the random audit is there's no other thing to distinguish them, as far as we can tell, other than being randomly selected into the audit. So because of the natural experiment, we're able to, in expectation, assume that all of those things are controlled for. So they're from Georgia, they're from South Dakota, they're from California.
You could be from any place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you just had to be grabbed in that 10% who were randomly audited. Yeah.
This is just pure nosiness.
Yeah, no, I mean, because I'm from the South, you might assume maybe the Southern members of Congress were more corrupt than others. I don't remember if that's what the finding was. But I will note, we also later, while I'm confident about the randomization and the ability to control for things in expectation, we also include some covariates for things like region later, like the South. Okay, and then the last example, this is a congressman I worked for briefly before I entered academia. Bill Hefner was a House member randomly assigned not to be audited. He's a wonderful person. He's an RIP, actually. He may have had violations. He may not have. We do not know, right? And so this is where voters could not update their perceptions on him. He's essentially in the control group. I liked him. This is on tape, so I'm not going to say what I was about to say. He might have had violations. You never know. You cannot know for sure. In the check kiting scandal that happened in the 90s, if you all recall, there were bounce checks from the Capitol Hill House Bank. It was a major scandal in the elections in the early 90s. He did not know if he bounced checks. And then after the list was released, he bounced 0, and he issued a very strong press release saying, I do not like that people have bounced checks in the Capitol House Bank, and was very against it. But it's sort of just an aside, not related to our paper. But in this case, he's like 90% of the legislators. We just don't know if they had disclosure. So from a voter interpretation perspective, the assumption would be there's no additional transparency. There's no additional information the voters can glean for these types of cases. No audit, no new information for voters. Okay, so we estimate the direct effect of the audit on the House income and vote shares. We estimate a linear model, OLS, with the random audit as the key independent variable or treatment variable. We assume the audit may decrease legislator vote share because it could sap resources away from the campaign. And then, of course, because nearly half of the audits had bad findings, could also decrease the vote share simply being driven by those legislators. Go ahead, Jenna.
You show the timeline earlier and put on there when the audits were made public. Mm-hmm. How were they made public? Can you just say a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, so there's the FEC released, what was it called, the FEC record. There's a document that came out monthly where the data source we used that the Bedrosian Center helped fund the RAs to go and track down, released data on when the audits were released. This FEC record publications, government publication, would just list the members and when the audits were made public.
No, but I mean, I may ask, do you expect that voters were aware of the results of the audits for the treatment group?
Oh, sure, I see what you're saying. So I'm pretty confident of that. I'm not 100% sure. One thing we would like to do is more systematically see how frequently it came up in campaigns. Billy Lee Evans, the case I talked about before where the violations were found, those came up after the audit from his challenger. Those were raised. There are a few cases that we want to find more information out about. Also, I read through some Politics in America's editions. It comes out every 2 years with members of Congress. And then a few of the people who are audited with findings, they don't mention the audit explicitly, but they mention campaign finance violations were part of the subsequent elections when they ran in '78 and also beyond '78 for those who survived. But we need to do a little bit more probably on systematic examination of that. It's just all of that's anecdotal. Okay, so we, especially for the causal mechanism, I assume that's what you're getting at, right? Did it sap resources or did voters actually punish due to information? We think it's the latter, mostly. But, all right, so we also estimate the intent to treat effect using the audit as an instrumental variable for having dirty campaign finance violations. And so what this means, we use the audit as an instrument for whether a legislator is revealed to have violations. So we estimate something called two-stage least squares. And so this is similar to what John Rogowski and Betsy Sinclair did in a political analysis piece examining office locations and which are randomly allocated in Congress, and if it had an impact on policymaking behavior. They found that it did not. And it's also similar if you're familiar with political science studies on get out the vote, where people will go, they want to see if knocking on the door and asking for someone to turn out to vote actually causes someone to turn out. And so the randomized treatment is you randomly select voters to get a door knock, and then you knock on the door. The people that answer are actually treated. The people that do not answer are not treated. And so the parallel in our study is voters want the door to open and find out if a legislator is dirty and has violated has campaign finance violations. And so the audit is the door knock. The people that have the violations are the ones that open the door. That's basically what this modeling assumption is doing. And so the first stage equation in the two-stage least square model uses the audit, 1 yes, 0 no, as an instrument for a legislator having campaign finance violations. All right, and so I made a big deal about how it's really cool. We have a natural experiment, random assignment. Nevertheless, it's 10% of 435 total legislators and actually a little bit fewer when we only look at incumbents. Because of that, we want greater precision in our estimates. We also include a number of additional variables in the model that typically predict election outcomes. In the model that looks at vote share, I think most importantly, we have vote share from the prior election. So what's really cool about that is we have the baseline, how did they do? Then we have this audit treatment, and then we have a post-treatment election share. Then we have a number of other variables typically used in congressional elections, like South at this time, because Southern elections were less competitive. If they're involved in some other scandal besides campaign finance, if the opponent spent a lot of money, they had a quality challenger, which is defined as a challenger who's held office previously, and then the presidential vote share in the district for the party of the incumbent, because that's right. If you're running in LA, and you're a Democrat, you're likely to win, even if you had bad campaign finance violations. But we also look at retire or resign as a dependent variable, include some similar variables, though also some other things like seniority, being in the leadership that typically impact retirement. And then the effort, how frequently did they go back to the district after the audit? We also look at similar variables, but add a few more that are relevant, like distance to district. This is one of the things that Bedrosian and RAs collected that took a bit of time actually to collect, but that was a nice variable to add. And then the previous number of trips were also included. So pre-treatment, the audit occurs, post-treatment measures. All right, so what are the results? The direct effect of the audit on legislator vote shares just suggests that those who were audited did worse in their subsequent election, in their next general election. The actual random audit, so this is where we're putting everyone audited together, the 36 people whose audits were released prior to the election plus the 5 who weren't. This should underestimate the effect because of those 5. We get a 3 percentage point. This is basically 3.18 percentage point decrease in the vote share for those people who were audited. And that includes clean and dirty. So that means the dirty effect is going to be big, just to give you a heads up. These are the p-values, the level of statistical significance. It's 0.09. Given the number of people in the audit, only 10%. That's and then given the magnitude of -3, I feel confident that there was some sort of effect. Those that were released to the public, so this is just those that were released prior to the election, excluding the 5 that weren't. It's a 4 percentage point, more than a 4 percentage point decrease in the vote share. And then a number of the variables that typically are included are also there. All right, so in general, those who got the audit, clean or dirty, lost about 3 or 4 percentage points vote share in the next election after the audit. All right, and so this is that 2-stage least squares.
Of the results?
Regardless of the results, yeah. So that's, yeah. And so as I'm about to show you, it's being driven by really big effects by the people where the violations were found. And so this is that 2-stage least square model that I talked about before, where we use as an instrumental variable the actual audit for those who had dirty violations. And the effect there, the incumbent was found to have campaign finance violations in the audit, negative 7.75 percentage point decrease in vote share in the 1978 election. This is in Model 2A, which I now don't recall the difference between 2A and 2B. Do you remember?
This is the same thing, whether the 5 cases are
Oh,
lumped
right, of
in,
course. Yeah, this is the one that has all cases in it, including the 5 that were released later, so we're probably underestimating the effect. This is when we measure it only as the 36 out of 41 cases who were audited. So that's almost a 15 percentage point decrease in vote share, which is just unbelievable if you think about congressional elections. That is not typical. Scandals do usually lead to 8-10 percentage point decreases in research that other people have done. And then again, a number of control variables. But just to point out, for instance, quality challenger is when somebody who has held prior office runs against you. This usually has a large effect on the outcome. It's an 11 percentage point decrease or a 12 percentage point decrease in the vote share if a state legislator ran against the member of Congress. That is almost the same size or slightly smaller than our audit effect. So that's pretty meaningful. Okay, so audited legislators, big takeaway, depending on the model, 7 to 14 percentage point decrease in vote share in 1978 relative to those in the control group when there were finance violations. Okay, so did this affect retirements? Did incumbents decide to run again or not? So this is the audit randomly assigned because the release of the information shouldn't affect their behavior. They knew they had violations even if the public wasn't told about it when they had the audits. What we see is basically an increase in retirement or resignation for those incumbents who were audited relative to those in the control group who were not. Okay. And so legislators in the audit treatment group were about 5 percentage points more likely to retire or resign if they got audited. So it's pretty significant, again, on that point. All right, and then again, did the dirty findings matter? If you were, those who were audited who had campaign finance violations, how likely were they to retire? It doubles the effect in the two-stage model. About 10 percentage points more likely to retire or resign if you were audited and you had campaign finance violations. So what's cool about this, just step back from a public policy perspective for a second, an executive agency funded by the legislative branch engaged in an audit that led to a 10 percentage point increase in retirements in the legislative branch. Like that is really, it's really amazing. And it was cut to $0 after this first year, right? Congress chose not to reauthorize the audit program as part of the FEC. And then over time, and Abby's more of the expert on the FEC than I am, over time has also just not spent a lot of, the legislature has not allocated a lot of resources to the FEC in general. Okay, and then finally, did the legislators go back home more often? Did the audit actually affect their behavior, potentially in a positive way, where the constituents have an opportunity to talk to their legislators more, see their legislators more? So if they were audited, they were 1.4 trips home to the district more than if they weren't audited. So it's pretty meaningful. And this was just in the quarter after the audit occurred, right? So that's important. Now those where violations were found, 3.9 trips home more. So their constituents saw them a lot. It didn't help them as much, but maybe they would have lost by 25 percentage points had they not gone home as much. Okay, so on average, almost 4 more trips home than legislators in the control group if campaign finance violations were found. All right, so what's the big takeaway? I mean, there's a couple things. Theoretically, this tells us a lot about campaign finance transparency, disclosure, and then audits in particular. When voters are able to get information about violations of their legislators, we might arguably have better legislators in office, right? Those who have violations. If the violations are correlated with other bad behavior, like the abscam sting found in the case of at least one legislator, this information about alleged corruption or even actual corruption might help the voters be informed, and the voters will react by not supporting candidates or not supporting incumbent legislators who've engaged in violations. It's also interesting that the legislators respond to these incentives, and these incentives were built in directly again by an executive agency that engaged in a program that changed the behavior of elected legislators, right? It's a pretty significant separation of powers finding and story. And then as I mentioned, it's also significant because the legislature said, we don't like this program. and we're now giving $0 to the program as soon as they did it. And also there was a lot of blowback as soon as the audit program was announced, even among members of Congress who were not in the audit group. And then in general, the policy implications. Should we bring these back? Like in an ideal world, not necessarily politically feasible world, should the FEC consider bringing back random audits? They still have audits now if there's some sort of whiff of violation or there's a complaint, but the random audits themselves would potentially put fear into those who might be engaging in campaign malfeasance or in terms of violations. And so that would be useful. And if, while it's not feasible with the current FEC, it may be feasible at the state level, right? So the FPPC in California, for instance, recently instituted random audits of candidates. Other state equivalents of the FEC could do the same if they wanted to. And so we think the policy implication is that these may be good programs to consider, especially for increasing transparency for voters, and then also creating behavior among legislators that is good for government and for citizens. And that's it. So.
I'm wondering what you think about the role of challenges. So I guess the FEC isn't really in a position to do these things. But your work suggests that they could be important and even beneficial to the whole paper. Thank you for presenting it. But, you know, as you say, challengers are the ones who would really have the built-in incentive to do this kind of audit and get it done if there's some whiff of the person they're going up against, their opponent, you know, maybe doing badly in an audit. So I wondered if you could just comment on like how close, either back then or now, can a challenger come to, you know, producing something that resembles an audit that the FEC does? Or how much is it really like there are protections against that kind of thing being released without like a congressional mandate for the FEC to do it? Can a challenger do some of this legwork on their own?
I can speak to that a little bit, yeah. So a challenger could definitely detect corporate contributions above the limit, things like that. They wouldn't be able to detect things like missing receipts, right? So they would catch, which missing receipts, right, that sounds trivial, but it could, like, missing receipts could be because things are being laundered, right? Because things are happening in cash that aren't allowed to be, right? So missing receipts could point to kind of bad things, even though to me it always sounds like, that's a missing receipt. So they would be able to detect some of it, right? Especially if things are coming through online, right? Then they get, like, it's all very automated to some degree. So they could, and they do, especially like at the presidential level, pick a lot of this up. And also, like, Center for Responsive Politics does some of it too, but they focus mostly on the salient races. Okay, so the opposition researchers are catching things. Did you see the report that both Trump and Clinton had like 10,000 violations? So that was probably mediated from Oppo research as opposed to the FEC actually reporting that out. I don't know for sure, because we just saw it in the media, right? Or we saw it from the Center for Responsive Politics. I have an experiment that I ran where we had a transparency group give a transparency grade to different candidates, and you do get voter reactions for that. So I think that the incentives are there for voluntary audits also because of that. Like you get a much bigger punishment effect than you do a reward for being clean, right? But again, like without having a true audit where you would be able to really dig around the bank statements and stuff, you're going to only capture part of it.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that?
Yeah,
Because
sure.
they did, the audits really got into their documentation or their lack of documentation, probably more importantly. So the illegal contributions in particular, they were not necessarily released, right? They didn't say, I got $5,000 from this corporation that's no longer allowed to give direct contributions to members of Congress. And so that would be non-disclosure combined with illegal contributions. That stuff the challengers couldn't get, but then all the
Unless
other
it
stuff,
happens,
yeah.
like sometimes it does happen online, right? Like Peter
If
Overton.
they report it, I guess it's
Yeah.
my
Are they
hunch,
dumb enough to report it?
like
right?
on the ones that, I mean, this is again, thank you to the RAs who worked on this, because they know this even better than us. But looking at some of the data they collected, some of it is just non-disclosure of significant amounts of money. They're trying to hide stuff, yeah. And so that the challengers couldn't get to, but the rest of it, yeah.
And so also, I didn't really talk about it, but they went to the field offices and spent 7 to 10 days
The
generally.
auditors, not the
auditors.
RAs, yeah.
Sorry, going through, and he said literally it was shoe boxes sometimes that people were keeping their receipts in. And then he went on a big rant about how they should all hire accountants. Why do they wait and just lawyer up later when they're under, investigation? So, seems like there's an easy way to avoid violations. Yeah.
So it's kind of related question. So I assume that it's kind of backed up by kind of legal power for them to do the audit. So I was wondering, so if without government backing, to what extent this kind of audit would be feasible if it's run by a nonprofit as a public service? Would that be feasible at all, or it has to be sort of backed up by some kind of a legal authority in order to make the audit work?
I'm grappling with that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Separating equilibrium.
I think a nonprofit could, so maybe not with Congress, because members of Congress are going to get, the challengers are going to be well funded, they're going to be able to do some of this. But if you think about a local election, state legislative elections where there are just simply not resources for challengers in a lot of races to go and do that work, a nonprofit could actually do do that work well, if not a federal agency.
But I want to kick it
Or a
around a little
state
bit too,
agency.
because it would be really helpful actually to hear from people in this room about this, because I'm trying to insert 2 paragraphs into a different paper right now. So if we're seeing some rewards and a big punishment, then in close races where like party heuristic isn't available, so like a primary for an open seat especially, then I think these results and the results in the experiment that I just mentioned point to a separating equilibrium where the clean candidate would want to go ahead, right, the good type candidate would want to go ahead and expose herself to an audit, like a real audit, and then assume there would either be an adverse inference against the candidate who chose not to, or force that other candidate into the audit also. What do you think of that? I mean, I think that's right. Right? Most of the stuff we see about this is whether corporations should voluntarily disclose certain things or not. And they talk about whether disclosure itself should be mandatory or voluntary, and we're the next step up, right? So disclosure has to be mandatory if the audits are going to be able to be voluntary. That's kind of where I'm at with it right now, but I'd love to hear.
Well, to answer
Yeah.
your question, I think the messaging would have to be extremely strong that you did it to yourself, because sometimes the information that gets out there, all they hear is, oh, he was audited, and they read the headline, they don't read the story, and so then they can lose 5 points according to your analysis. So I was wondering, along those lines on process, you said there's no more random, but what is the process? Does a complaint trigger an audit? Because it seems that that's the case, every challenger would be doing that because they would get 5
Right.
points just because an audit happened.
Yeah, so the Campaign Legal Center files a bunch of these complaints. The opposition researchers file these complaints, the opponents or whatever. Yeah.
They wade through it and decide to go forward or not.
Yeah, and it takes like 5 or 6 rounds of votes for an actual finding to be made at the FEC, and you need 4 votes each time. And if anybody knows about the FEC, right, it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And since 2008, the Republicans, every single vote, have voted in a block. So if there's going to be any action made, which they're also voting to not do anything, right? Then the Democrat, generally Ann Ravel, who used to run the FPPC, has to cross the aisle to vote, because the other 2 Democrats are super entrenched also. So
3-3 nothing
yeah, so people file. What happens is they file and they have a press release.
about the complaint.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm curious about if the ones, the candidates who were audited who wound up being clean, because I was unclear about like just having the audit itself was also negative towards the campaign, or like for those ones who were found to be clean, was it positive for them? Was there any significant effect for them?
So, I mean, most of the effect is driven by those almost half of people that have dirty audits. But we wanted to look at audits only, both clean and dirty, less to examine was there no effect on clean candidates, but more that's the direct random assignment. And so the assumption would be, theoretically, voters will not punish clean members. That doesn't make any sense. There may be no effect, right? Because it's a lot harder to go and say, look, I did what you would expect I should do as an elected official. Please give me extra points for that. And so that random audit variable is really trying to capture the random assignment of the negative effect that would occur from those who have dirty audits in terms of the theoretical expectation also.
Do you have, I'm thinking about this coefficient, is there a coefficient that shows the gap between dirty audited and clean audited?
We didn't do that in here, no. I mean, well, there is sort of a gap if you take this 2-stage least square effect and then multiply that times about half, a little less than half. That's basically the difference.
You couldn't have the 2 dummies, right? You couldn't decompose, like in your very first regression, you could decompose the that audited into audit clean, audit dirty.
So we did that
And
in,
then not audited is the omitted.
yeah, we did that
category.
initially, and
Yeah.
then the pushback was that's not random and you're not getting any leverage. Why don't you just go collect current data on audits and you'll have a larger sample size? And so we can do that, but we didn't do that because of the random. We wanted to measure the random assignment more than the actual.
Yeah, so they're different things. So I would say in addition, because one thing, no, this isn't one of my things. I like to be able to just calculate the effect by looking at the table. And, that would be a simple subtraction, right? Which would be interesting. And it would get to your second point, which is that almost all the effect is from the and the clean, the clean folks ultimately don't get affected at all. That's kind of buried in here because we only see the big negative without seeing the point.
Yeah. So what you're saying is to run it just like we had before, where the omitted category is not audited, and then it's a 1 or a 0 on whether it was a dirty audit.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had done that originally, but yeah, I like this because then it allows us to back out the effect of being clean, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was wondering whether kind of there's a way of looking at the severity of violation. I was wondering, was there any actual legal ramification for the dirty?
Oh, yeah.
So were there legal sanctions? So some might be technical violations, some could be
Yeah.
kind of big.
Yeah, they pay fines. They pay
They do,
fines.
okay.
But I thought you were going to ask a different question, which is the hit proportional to the severity?
The hit, what do you mean by the hit?
The punishment.
Right, so
The FEC
suppose,
punishment.
like, you have one violation, you didn't disclose 50,000, the other violation, you didn't disclose 500,000. Does that lead to a difference in terms of how the electorate responds?
So we could look at the data for that. In my conversation with the auditor, he said, it ends up being kind of negotiated, and they have these memoranda that float around. And I had, as you were asking the question, I had like a little quote from him in mind. But that they never wanted to publish what the actual criteria were because they thought that gave an incentive to go just below the threshold before the fine would really be active. But we could go look and just see what the kind of end fine ended up being compared to the size of the violation. The other thing is, it sort of requires us to make judgments on severity of violations. So we could look at particular subcategories, but we've only got 41 cases, right? Of which only 20 or so were dirty, and so it's going to end up being kind of
My
more
hunch is
anecdotal,
though
maybe.
that it might not matter because they did not, these really low ones, now 50,000 is high and 500 is really high, but the really low ones they didn't count as violations. But from a campaign, like in the district standpoint, when you're voting for your incumbent or not your incumbent who only had 50,000 violations, but Newt Gingrich had 500K, so I guess he's not as bad. Or so in terms of the voter decision, I don't know if that would matter. But we should look at it because there's a lot more hay to be made in campaign mailers if the dollar amount is bigger, right? Like it sounds worse, but it also just sounds bad in general, right?
You guys could just, I hate starting a phrase like that. But it seems to me that if you know what the reported violation was, you could just make a table where you rank order the candidates by the size of the violation, and then just show what you could run almost as like a simulation using your model to estimate what the loss in voter share is, right? Which could be an interesting.
But so how do we measure severity? By the size of the fine?
You could do it either way. I was actually thinking the size of the reported violation, right? Because the fines are almost certainly less than what the violation was.
And do we count? I mean, I don't mean to push back, but like you know this stuff probably better than me. So, do we count like a non-reported violation more than like a late reported violation? Because they're both going to have a number next to them, right? Or like a corporation corporate contribution different from an excessive contribution, right?
You know, that's interesting. I don't know what, see, like to me.
It's like a lot of judgment calls.
No, to me, this is actually a different paper.
Okay.
Because it's really.
That's what I like to hear, yeah.
It's really the question of what does the electorate perceive, right? So I don't want to make that decision.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I want to see what the voters did. Like, if it was late, did the voters respond differently?
Some of you were saying a dollar number, how would that affect them?
Right, or is it a dollar number, is it
So
the size
maybe
of the fine? Right.
So we let the size of the punishment tell us what the voters care about.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, and even, I mean, to me, illegal corporate contribution sounds really bad. But maybe in 1978 it wasn't because corporations had been donating money just a few years prior, and no?
Corporate contributions have always been forbidden since like 1880.
Union corporations?
Don't think so.
Union donations? No? Okay.
Sorry, I don't mean to like.
Okay, I'm not the, as you can tell, I'm not the campaign finance person on this paper. I'm the congressional elections person on the paper.
But
thank you
excessive
for
contributions
correcting
for
me.
sure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe they've always sounded bad, but yeah.
Yeah.
Since the 1800s. The on the dollar amounts, I do remember I did the two-stage model with instead of just 0, 1, was there a violation? I forgot the number I used. Some cutoff above,
Like 10,000.
some X dollar. Was it 10,000? Yeah. And that the results were similar, but I can't remember if the magnitude was greater, which is actually your question. So I just don't remember.
You know, this House just voted they voted and they voted not to get rid of the ethics office. That was an independent office. Like, how would that relate to this sort of thing? Like,
Go.
So I mean, I'm not as familiar with that Office of Ethics, but I mean, the one thing that, as far as I understand, that they did was when there were major, like the complaints could be filed and there might be investigations. And so basically any sort of independent audit information that might reveal scandal or sort of bad behavior, corruption, et cetera, these sort of watchdogs, audits, et cetera, can be helpful to informing people.
but they're not proactive in any way. There needs to be a complaint filed first. And
Yeah, but so there's some other research that looks at scandal and its effect on congressional elections, and they sometimes measure scandal as if it came up, and so it's in some ways it's like the audit program, but it's not random. Some people might be engaging in bad behavior and no one's noticing, and then some people are, and due to the complaint, it comes up, and then those studies show the effect of scandal leads to lower vote shares too. But the problem is it's not. What's cool about the random program? Yeah, what's cool about this one is it's actually getting people, regardless of if there's some incentive, to try to get them, right? And you're getting some of the members who did bad things, but like with the current way the things are run, or had previously been run, also, or in the past, who's on the House Ethics Committee would matter too. I'm forgetting his name. There was a movie made about him. Was put on the House Ethics Committee a couple decades ago. Because he didn't want to enforce anything on most of his friends, including some of the leadership. And so that stuff matters too, but basically getting the information is helpful. This is probably better because it's not politically targeted.
I think the example you gave points to the media influence. I'm almost not sure that what happened, funding down to 0, could happen today. Because same thing that happened with the alarm over the ethics would happen. Because how could you realistically sell that this program exposed these many, so we're going to shut it down and that would be okay?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Today's media.
I mean, because in California they're doing it now. They just implemented it, and
The randomness?
yeah,
So
and
did that need an act of the legislature to do that?
I think the FPPC did it on their own, but I'm sure if the legislature wanted to stop it, they could pass a bill, right? But if you go to Google News, type in FPPC, campaign finance violation, between November and December of last year, you'll see a lot. And so I'm sure those members of the legislature are not happy about it. But the thing is, if there aren't that many of them where there are violations, it's mostly local elected officials, they'll keep it, or it might be an environment where you can't get rid of things like this now. I mean, back then it was post-Watergate, lots of reforms had been passed, the FEC was kept. You know, they didn't eliminate the whole thing, they just eliminated one program.
Well, I want to back up because I'm totally ignorant of what the process is. When somebody's running for office, do they have to file all of their campaign expenses? And then do they have their own auditor before they, or not? And then you're talking about these are independent, random audits that they were doing. But
Yeah.
what is the process?
So this is the federal candidates are, especially the incumbents, are a little more professionalized than the challengers or the local or state people, right? So that's just kind of step one, which means they might be more likely to have an internal accountant. But this guy I was talking to, who was at the FEC since its inception until like 2015 or something, was ranting about how a lot of them don't have accountants on their staffs and really are still in this day working from shoeboxes.
Okay.
Yeah. And, well, I don't know. I can't remember. I'm sorry.
But they have to file something, right?
Exactly, yeah. Right. And so they have some volunteer, right, go through it and file, and they have these deadlines that get quicker as the election approaches, right? So, and then, you know, when we get in a certain reporting window, they have to file all contributions above a certain amount, right, or all expenditures above a certain amount within 48 hours of the receipt or the expenditure, right? There's a bunch of, I mean, it's actually fairly complicated to comply with, which is a big complaint on people who want to deregulate this kind of stuff, is that the compliance costs are actually pretty high and they can be a barrier to entry for unsophisticated challengers. This is probably especially true at the local or state level.
Yeah, or underfunded challengers.
Yeah, exactly, because it costs money.
The incumbents that can raise a lot of money can just hire someone to do all the paperwork, and they've typically worked on other campaigns, and you're probably less likely to have violations then.
Right.
But
The FEC travels the country. They have like a traveling team who goes around trying to help candidates comply. So they're really doing a lot of outreach on this stuff. Maybe in part because that's kind of complicated.
Is there literature on just like how people change their behavior when they are being audited? Like, is that a factor in what, you know, how they wound up being voted on? I don't know, did they just...
I mean, I would say this, right?
yeah.
Which we haven't posted yet.
What do you
But I don't know
mean?
what other literature there is on how people act when they're being audited.
On
I mean,
actual audits is very little.
corporations.
There's one study in
Tax.
South America where there were audits that were done on local mayoral races that have some similar findings to ours.
That's
They
in
don't look at
Brazil.
the behavior. Was it Brazil?
Yeah, I think so.
But then the effect of audit, lots of work looking at audits, the effect of audits on policy outcomes and randomized control trials to evaluate policy, and lots of literature on that, but less on this kind of audit. I think the one in Brazil and ours are the only ones that I'm familiar with. But the other thing, I don't know how many master's students are in the audience, but if there are, one way to think about it is this auditor that Abby interviewed, he just retired, he started probably straight out of his MPA program.
He went to the GAO and audited senators because the senators were already being audited. So he did that, and then the FEC was created, and he and a bunch of people went over, and they brought the GAO kind of culture with them, and so they did things like exit interviews at the end of the audits because that's what they'd always done at the GAO, and so that's how we're able to predict the legislative behavior, right? But yeah, he was in his, probably 20s
and so
when he started all this.
That was the thing, is like, you have a great idea, and just go do it, but just make sure you check with the political principals or the legislators and give them a heads up about what's happening if you want to continue doing the good idea. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you
That was very
much.
helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the support. Yeah.